Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how your two brain hemispheres work together to see the world? Well, this new study might have a clue. So, we all know our brain has two halves, right? And they're both busy processing all the visual information that comes our way. But do they do it in exactly the same way, or is there a sort of secret specialization going on? This research dives deep into that question, looking at how our left and right brain halves handle what we see right in the center of our vision. The stuff we focus on. Imagine you are looking at a beautiful painting. It seems like one smooth experience. But behind the scenes, your brain is working hard, and its two halves might actually be whispering different pieces of information to each other to create that single, coherent picture. The researchers here wanted to see if the left and right hemispheres have distinct ways of coding or processing visual information, and how they manage to get on the same page. To figure this out, they used a cool technique called electroencephalography, or EEG. Think of it like putting a special cap on people with lots of little sensors that can pick up the electrical signals from their brain. They then used a fancy method called neural decoding to try and figure out what the brain was thinking or processing just by looking at those electrical patterns. They had 20 people look at a rapid stream of images, objects, faces, and words presented right in the middle of their vision. Crucially, when something is in the fovea, the very center of your vision, it actually sends signals to both sides of your brain. This is key because it lets researchers compare how both hemispheres are handling the exact same visual input. And guess what they found? Pretty fascinating differences. It turns out the left and right hemispheres aren't just copies of each other in how they process things. The left side seems to be a bit more attuned to sharp angles and straight lines, which they call rectilinearity. The right side, on the other hand, seemed to have a special preference for color. So even though they're seeing the same thing, they're picking up on slightly different aspects of it. Now, this is super important because it adds another layer to what we know about brain specialization. We often hear about how the left brain is more logical and the right brain more creative, but this study is looking at something more fundamental, at the very early stages of visual processing. Even for simple things like shapes and colors, there is a division of labor. Other studies have shown differences when something is shown only to one side of your vision, like you might see with things in your peripheral vision. But this study is special because it is looking at what happens when both hemispheres get the direct input, which is what happens with the things you focus on. This is where things get really interesting. They're not just showing the same thing to both halves, they're tracking how the information unfolds over time after the image appears. The researchers are very open about their work, which is fantastic. They're sharing their code and data, so other scientists can build on it. They had 20 volunteer participants to do this study. They presented images very quickly, one after another, for a short time. This rapid sequence presentation helps them tease apart the very early brain responses to each image. Imagine a flipbook, but with brain activity. And they had a side task to keep everyone focused. They had to watch for a red dot that might appear at the different locations where images could be shown and press a button. If they saw it, they were paying attention to the screen, but it was designed to be unrelated to the actual images they were processing. So they're recording from these 64 electrodes on the scalp. Then they cleaned up the data, filtering out noise and just focusing on the relevant time windows after each image flashed. Now, for the decoding part, they took the EEG data from specific groups of electrodes that are known to be involved in vision, one group for the left hemisphere and one for the right. At each tiny slice of time, they trained a computer to recognize the patterns of brain activity associated with different images. If the computer could tell which image was shown based on the brain signals from that specific moment, it meant the brain was encoding information about that image. To understand what kind of information the hemispheres were picking up, they also analyzed the images themselves. They looked at things like how much color was in an image, its brightness, and especially its structure, like the presence of straight lines or corners. They even measured something called rectilinearity, which is basically how much of an image is made up of straight lines and angles. They also used something called representational similarity analysis. This is a way to compare how similar the brain's responses are to different images. If two images create very similar brain patterns, they're considered represented. Similarly, they then compared these brain similarity patterns to the actual visual feature similarities of the images. This figure helps visualize how all the different image features relate to each other. For example, they might see that images with lots of color also tend to have certain kinds of edges. Let's get to the exciting results. This graph shows how well the computer could tell which image was being shown based on the brain signals over time. You can see that both hemispheres are decoding information above chance, meaning they're processing the images. But look closely, the timing and the strength of that decoding are a bit different between the left and right sides. The right hemisphere, for example, had a couple of distinct peaks where decoding was really strong. Here you can see the overall decoding accuracy. About 50% means the computer is doing better than random guessing. They use really rigorous statistical methods like Bayes factors, which basically tell you how much evidence the data provides for one idea over another. This is where the core findings really shine. This graph shows how well the brain's representation of an image matched the specific visual features of that image, separately for each hemisphere. As predicted, the left hemisphere showed a stronger connection with models of rectilinearity, meaning its brain patterns were more similar to images with lots of straight lines and angles. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, had a stronger connection with color, meaning its brain patterns better reflected the color content of the images. They found that the left hemisphere's preference for straight lines was quite distinct. It was more pronounced and showed up earlier in the processing timeline compared to the right hemisphere. And you can see here that color, along with some aspects of spatial frequency and brightness, were more strongly represented in the right hemisphere. These are not tiny differences. Either the statistical evidence, the Bayes factors, were